Well, this is the wood for the tops and bases of the altar and pulpit, and it's Douglas Fir, vertical grain or quarter sawn. I put a little water on the grain here. You can see how tight grain this is. It's really nice stuff. It's expensive, even though it grows out here, but it's nice. And I bought this down in Edensaw Woods in Port Townsend, and what I like about them is they let you go through the stack and pick out what you want. And so, of course, it was all good stuff. Wasn't too hard to pick out, but this is real nice. What I'm going to do is plane and joint and plane this to get it where I can really get a good look at it. Then measure out each piece, deciding exactly where it's going to go. Really shooting for very little waste. And once I know where it's all going to go, then we'll start the assembly process, and we'll just carry on. Well, I bought this fir for the tops and bases of the pieces. I bought this about 70 days ago on the 5th of November. And shortly after bringing it into the shop, I used my pinless moisture meter to measure. And I know you can't see this, but I recorded 17.2% moisture content, which is really high. In this shop, my wood stays about 9% moisture content. So it was the heating season, and it still is. And I thought, well, I'll just let this sit for as long as I can before I actually need it, and see if the moisture equalizes. Well, like I say, it's 70 days later, and it's still reading. 17, well, depending on where I put this thing. So I'm reading 16 right now, okay? So it maybe came down a little bit. A little while ago I measured it was 17.2 again, so we're roughly still kind of high. So I thought, well, maybe the pinless just isn't really working right, because it kind of depends on the density of the wood. So I've got a pin type moisture meter. I've had this thing for years. I mean, decades. And so I went ahead and let's go ahead and put that in. It's a group 3 wood, so I set my dial for group 3. And the shop is 68 degrees. That's what this meter is calibrated for, so there's no correction required. But I've got the long pin, so I'm putting it in kind of deep. And I'm showing just a little under 15% moisture content. So turns out the pinless is probably pretty accurate. I tried the same thing on a different piece, and I got similar results. So it's higher moisture content that I like to see, because the top is going to, the pieces are going to shrink. But on the other hand, they didn't come down very much, if at all. And so I can't, wait forever. So the way I'll build this is I'll build it in such a manner that it can change, shrink down without cracking on the ends, and we should be okay. By the way, this particular piece is the piece with the highest moisture content that I could find. A lot of the wood is actually in the 9% range, so overall I'm not going to have a real big problem. But
smiles as if, you know, as if his wife's talking about someone else that he happened to so obviously. But then I listened to the Four Seasons version of the same song, and it too is incredible.
Glue up the pieces for the top. I've got four pieces, roughly 2 inches thick, 8 inches wide, and I'm using Type On 3, which is a plastic glue. In other words, it can move over time. It's called creep. And on the top, I don't want the wood to move at all, such that when you run your hand across the joints, you'll feel a raised ridge. So to try to cut down on that creep, I'm going to install dominoes, and I've got 5mm by 30mm dominoes. I'll put 5 of them on each joint, so a total of 15 dominoes. So when I glue up, at least I've got a mechanical lock, to try to keep the 2 pieces of wood going like this. This top is just way too big and heavy to put up on the crosscut saw, so I'm just going to use, I got the Milwaukee saw there with a 42-inch fine tooth cut blade and a guide. We ought to be able to make a nice clean cut with that. Well, I'm testing out a new microphone I have. It's a wireless job, and make it so I can walk around and talk at the same time. Okay, so this is the top for the altar, and it's upside down. And the idea is that the altar carcass is going to fit into this recess that I made by gluing in blocks of wood. And that gives me the thickness I wanted on the top, which is about 2.5 inches. And it also helps me center the altar top on the carcass, but more importantly, I wasn't able to get the top of the carcass perfectly planar. In other words, it rocks a little bit. So I thought, well, I've got the height I need from ground, from floor to top of the top. So I can afford to inset the altar carcass into this top a little bit. So what I'll do is, after I glue on these pieces, and I've already got half of these glued, I've got this line and that line glued. After I finish the glue up, then I'm going to place shims, something like half this thickness, 1/4 inch, something like that. Shim here, that'll be my main contact points for the top, which I can screw the top, from from the bottom of the carcass, I've got a flange, and screw the top on, and then put shims every so often along here and screw them on. But on these, I'm going to use elongated holes because I know that this top can grow and shrink a little bit with changes in humidity over the seasons. So if I have elongated holes on this and over here, but firmly screw down in the centers, then the center is fixed and the edges can move a little bit. So that's the plan, and so I'm going to go ahead and glue this up now. Okay, so I set it on in here, had to do a little trimming around these openings for the corners, but got it set down, and then I put in shims, kind of like this. This is probably, 3/16 to 1/4 inch thick plywood, and I've got one here, one here. These two are large. They're about 7.5 inches long. And these are the ones that'll get screwed into firmly, okay, because that will center this top on the carcass, and the top can expand and contract away from the center. And then I've got 3 shims back here and 3 up here. Now when people pick this up, they're going to lift it from the top. I know that's going to happen. So these screws through these shims plus the ends are going to take most of the weight, and these. But this one in the middle, this is kind of flimsy. It's just a piece of plywood. It's mostly just to strengthen the carcass out here. Okay, now because I told you that this carcass is not totally flat, I've actually had to put some shims made out of veneer, and so I've measured, where I have 1 shim, 2 shim, 3 shims thick, and now I'm going to take these plywood shims out, glue the veneer on, and make them permanently the correct thickness. And also I've marked where these shims go so that I can then drill the holes from the top, that the screws will go through. So next time I set this down, hopefully it'll be the final time I set it down and I can put all the screws in. Okay, and then also once this is off, I can clean all the top off. Well, I rounded all the corners and I've done some rough sanding. I sanded the top to 150 grit using the Festool orbital sander, and the edges and the ends with 220 on my block. Noticed a little check starting to form here on the end. You might be able to see that. So I decided to go ahead and, since I'm not going to work this for a little while, put some clamps on each end, let it rest while I work on some of the other parts. The design calls for texture carving on the fronts of the bases and tops, and so I experimented a little bit on this block here using a crooked knife, and the texturing wasn't quite as deep as I wanted. People are going to be sitting 100 feet away from this in the church sanctuary, so they've got to be able to see some texturing, and I just couldn't really bring it out on this little sample with this crooked knife. So I changed my technique to use a number 8 50 gouge, but to use it as a knife. And so here is the base of the pulpit. This is the back side, which I carved first to try to get my technique down. And I think you'll see that it's a fairly distinct pattern on there, maybe even a little too distinct. I may end up toning it down a little bit with some sandpaper. I've got to make that decision. So I've gone ahead and I've marked these 45-degree angle lines on the base of the altar. And the idea is I use this gouge and carve a little gully between each of these lines. Now, you notice that these come to a point here, here, and here. Same thing on here. We've got a point here, here, and here. And that's 3, the number of the Trinity. So it's just another piece of symbolism that goes into this. Now, my friend Dale, who's a very, very talented carver here in the Sequim area, taught me that when you're texturing, try to use a light that gives you a raking light, because it'll show up the shadows on the texture and help you texture better. So I've got my lines, and what I try to do is I try to just creep up and touch the line on each side with the number 850 chisel. And I do kind of a cross grain. I'm not chiseling with the grain, because then there's too much chance of a piece of wood lifting out, splitting and lifting out. So it's more of a kind of a slicing. And there's nothing fast about this. But you only get one chance to do it right. This being the last cuts you do on the piece. And this chisel is razor sharp. That's why I wear these gloves. These are actually the kind of gloves that it's hard for a blade to cut through. They're specifically made for that. And I learned I need this the hard way. Now, to keep this blade razor sharp, you don't have to go back to the grindstones. What you do is you hone it, and there's a couple ways to do it, but this is a fast way. This is a leather stropping wheel, and this is a little honing compound, and this is just a cloth buffing wheel. So what I'll do is I'll put a little honing compound on here, and then I will sharpen the bevel again. I shouldn't say sharpen it, hone it, and then I'll come over to this cloth wheel and try to get the burr off. And once the burr, it's a little fold over a very tiny thin steel, and once that's gone, then you're razor sharp. There it is. It's nice and sharp now. I'm not going to test it. I'll test it on the real wood. I want these bases to be able to slide on the floor, and so I bought these little sliders. They stick on, but the darn things, they sit kind of high. So when you turn this over, this base is sitting up off the floor a 1/4 inch. So I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recess. I'm going to make 4 corner recesses for these to fit into, about 1/8 of an inch, which is about as thick as this padding stuff. And they don't compress much either, by the way. So as it turns out, when I get these set in there, that'll kind of halve the height. They'll probably be about 1/8 of an inch high. I think that'll be good for sliding. So to route out that little 1/8 inch deep pocket for these to fit into, I'm going to make a little jig here. I got a 2 5/8 inch square here with 1/4 inch radius corners that I'm going to cut on the CNC machine. And then to actually make these pockets, because I can't fit this on the CNC machine, it's too high, plus obviously the altar base could be way too big for my little machine. What I'll do is I'll use a router with a guide, 1/2 inch diameter guide, 3/8 router bit goes into it, and route this, and I'll end up with 3/8 inch diameter or radius or diameter, I guess, corners with a 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch recess. Ought to work real good. Well, here's the finished base for the pedestal. I jumped ahead a little bit. There's finish on this, but you'll see that in the next video series. But I think it turned out kind of nice. There's the back. Sides, lots of good grain. And the front. Thanks for watching.